Help give kids an extra life by donating today to help sick and injured children. Link in the description and pinned comment below.
Are there any actual scientific health benefits to touching grass?
Atari. While not the company that invented video games per se, they were the first company to make them commercially successful. And it's safe to say that without Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, and the company they created, gaming as we or anyone else knows it probably would never have existed. Throughout its history, the Atari name has changed hands at least a few times, and the brand itself has seen both the most stratospheric of highs and the most dismal of lows. In recent years, Atari, under its current ownership, has been crawling itself back into some degree of relevance. It hasn't always been easy, and not every idea was a good one, let's face it, but they eventually found ideas that worked, both appealing to the retro crowd and the modern public. But like many legendary game companies, it all started in the arcade. So today we're going to celebrate this legendary icon by looking at some of their best arcade games. Now keep in mind, I'm specifically referring to Atari Incorporated, not the company that went by Atari Games. I talked about that distinction when I did my video on Gauntlet. Anyways, get ready for the coolest history lesson this side of Schoolhouse Rock. I make learning fun. It's game time! Yeah, what better way to start off this list than with the game that effectively started the arcade game industry? Well, if you want to be super technical, the first arcade game was Computer Space in 1971, but that didn't exactly set the world on fire. But Pong? Yeah, Pong wasn't just a game changer, it was a game starter. Nowadays we have games with huge open worlds, tons of playable characters, and an incessant constant need to be bigger. Back then, all we needed was just two lines batting a pixel back and forth. Funny enough, Pong was originally intended to be a training exercise for the game's designer, Alan Alcorn. Both Bushnell and Dabney knew the guy from his electrical engineering experience, having worked with him previously before Atari was even founded. Inspired by previously released computer versions of tennis, most notably the Magnavox Odyssey version, which led to a lawsuit by the way, Bushnell gave Alcorn a project to make a version of it for themselves. And Alcorn's improvements proved to make the game better and more exciting. For instance, dividing the paddle into programmatic segments which determined the angle of the ball depending on where it hit the paddle added more strategy to the game. After all, what's the fun in just setting two paddles in front of the ball and just letting it bounce endlessly? Another thing that was added was the gradual acceleration of the ball over time requiring sharper reflexes. And finally, the paddles couldn't go all the way to the top or bottom due to a defect that was never fixed, because otherwise a round could theoretically last forever. What we eventually got was simple, fun, and addicting, even to this day. Not to mention all the home Pong consoles we ended up getting.
And another one! And another one! And another one! Have you played Atari today?
Okay, so way back when I first started my QG at the Arcade series, which by the way you should really watch those videos too, I talked about how the General Computer Corporation, or GCC for short, got in a bit of hot water because of some of the enhancement kits they made. I also mentioned that one of those legal disputes was with Atari. Well, they ended up settling out of court, and part of the deal was that GCC got contracted to develop games for them. One such game was Food Fight, aka the only way you can play with your food without incurring the wrath of overbearing parents. You control Charlie Chuck, whose only ambition in life is the ultimate confectionery pursuit. The perfect ice cream cone. Unfortunately, there's one little problem standing in his way.
Open Hell's Kitchen.
Yeah, meet Oscar, Angelo, Jacques, and Zorba, the most anti-fun chefs that ever slipped on an apron. They probably got thrown out of the kitchen by Gordon Ramsay, and they're taking out their anger on poor Charlie. Oh, and since this is apparently Hell's Kitchen, the ice cream's melting fast. But hey, a hungry kid with a sweet tooth's gotta defend himself, right? Good thing there's ammo lying everywhere in the form of foodstuffs like pies, bananas, tomatoes, and more projectile produce and pastries. But of course, they're not exclusive to you. The chefs can grab the food as well and fling it back at you. Sounds like an episode of Codename Kids Next Door. Also, well-placed pits can help you get the drop on your foodie foes, but every pit has two sides to it. While this game could have lent itself well to being a twin-stick shooter, it does manage to handle itself effectively with only one stick. The colorful graphics also underscore the childish tone of the game. It was a great work for both Atari and GCC, who would go on to also develop Quantum, and also even help design the 7800, among other things.
Not bad for a company that started out making bootlegs.
In the 70s and early 80s, during the golden age of arcades, genres were still being established, so the idea of a game that mixes multiple genres was exceedingly rare back then. But once again, Atari innovated during that era. Case in point, 1984's Major Havoc. The first of several games on this list with vector graphics, Major Havoc was an interesting beast. Developed by Owen Rubin and Mark Cerny, Major Havoc is a triple-decker showcase of innovation. You play as a clone of the titular hero as he fights to save humanity from the remnants of an interstellar empire. There's 3 parts to this mission. First, you play a space shooter level as you blast away at the enemy ship's defenses in your Catastrophighter. Yes, that is the ship's name. Once the flagship's defenses are down, you need to land your fighter on top of the indicated marker in a sequence reminiscent of Lunar Lander, another Atari game notorious for its difficulty. And finally, you have a platforming sequence where you have a floaty space jump and a barrier to protect yourself. Your goal is to make your way to the flagship's reactor with the limited amount of oxygen you have, set it to self-destruct, and get the hell out of there! Maybe this is where Metroid got the idea for its own escape sequences. Each loop is even preceded by an approach sequence where you can play a breakout minigame for extra lives and warps. And you had to control your character using either a roller control on dedicated cabinets, or in the case of conversion kits for older games, you were using the rotary knob. That's quite an interesting setup, but then again, this is an interesting game. Like I said, blending genres was rare back then, so this was a fascinating sight in arcades. Fun fact, there's actually a ROM hack / director's cut of the game subtitled The Promised End, which contains content that was cut from the original game. And the team actually managed to get Owen Rubin himself involved. I guess when you have unfinished business, you'll take any opportunity to finish it, am I right? Licensed games are a common target for ridicule, and historically it's been for good reason. A lot of licensed games, especially in the early days, were lacking in quality, and were often little more than cash-ins for big contracts. Atari in particular was involved in some pretty infamous ones. Need I bring up the straw that broke the camel's back? Even with that said, however, being in the early days was no excuse for shoveling out crap. Especially since even then Atari was capable of making good licensed games. Just look at what they did with Star Wars in the arcade. Released in 1983, 6 years after the original film, Atari Star Wars recreates the climax of the original classic. The iconic attack on the Death Star, complete with digitized voices and chiptune covers of John Williams' legendary music. The game takes place in 3 repeating segments. In Part 1, you blast away at TIE fighters as you make your way to the Death Star. Darth Vader even gets in on the action. In Phase 2, starting with the second wave, you fly across the surface of the Death Star, blasting at turrets in your way and towers in later waves. And finally, you enter the legendary Trench Run, including a digitized version of Obi-Wan's Use the Force line. All with Atari's signature vector graphics. The gameplay was smooth and tight, with the controls of the X-Wing being easy and intuitive. You had a steering yoke with 4 laser buttons at your disposal, and the whole thing felt great to use. Originally, this controller was used for an army training simulator based on Battlezone, another one of Atari's old arcade games. In fact, this game originally started out under a completely different title. Development of the game started in 1981 under the name of Warp Speed. The project was originally headed by Ed Rotberg, who had also worked on Battlezone. But after he left Atari in late 1981, Atari worked out a deal with Lucasfilm to turn it into a Star Wars game. And the rest is history. Later, Atari would create a conversion kit for the game based on The Empire Strikes Back, but that wasn't as successful.
I mean, arcades were making bank off this game, so if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right?
Pong may not have been the first tennis video game, but it was the first tennis game to be commercially successful. Likewise, Breakout was the first successful block breaker game, and would go on to spawn many other block breaker games like it. It was as simple as a block breaker game could be, which makes sense considering it was the archetype. So when Bushnell said he wanted to update the game, what did the engineers decide to do? Well, make it super, of course! Super Breakout, written and coded by the Ed Boys known as Rotberg and Log, used an MOS Technology 6502 microprocessor instead of the original game's discrete logic, and while the former is overall faster, the microprocessor was capable of doing more. In this case, more meant including 3 different variations of Breakout in one cabinet. Double gave the player control of a set of 2 paddles, one over the other, and you had to manage 2 balls at once. Good thing you have 2 eyes to focus on the game with. Next, there was Cavity, a game mode where you start with bouncing 1 ball, but the playfield has 2 more balls bouncing around in holes in the playfield.
Only, it doesn't make a bit of difference, guys. The balls are inert.
At least they're inert until you open the cavities, and then you can use them and even rack up a score multiplier as long as they're in play. The third game mode is Progressive, in which you face an ever-advancing onslaught of bricks as they endlessly march toward you like the inevitable advance of time towards an inexorable end. That, of course, being a game over. Almost seems like a metaphor. Whatever. The game proved to be a success for Atari and a solid follow-up to the original Breakout as one of the first great video game sequels, building upon the foundation of the original like any good sequel should. Though it's strange that this would be the pack-in game for the 5200. But then again, who cares about the 5200? Certainly not modern Atari. And here's another fun fact for all of you. This game even has an audio drama. Yeah, in 1982, a fellow by the name of John Braden recorded a 33 1/3 RPM record giving this game a story. Can you believe that?
Who would have thought that a game about bouncing a ball off of a paddle at an array of bricks could have a story to it, huh?
Mascots. Sports teams have them, schools have them, and several corporations have them too, especially video game companies. Nintendo has Mario, Sega has Sonic, Bandai Namco has Pac-Man, and Atari has... Wait, does Atari actually have one? Well, kinda, but I'm not sure how many of you know him. He's this guy, Bentley Bear, and in 1983 he appeared in a maze game called Crystal Castles. The game tasks you with collecting gemstones scattered across the maze, kinda like Pac-Man. But there are some key differences. For starters, we have a trimetric perspective, making the mazes look more dynamic as opposed to simply having it be top-down like most maze games. Second, and more significantly, you control Bentley using a trackball. Now there are plenty of trackball-based games out there, but you typically don't control a maze game with one of those things. That makes for a unique control scheme, especially considering you also have a jump button, which is something we didn't get in Pac-Man until 1987. As you venture through the castles, you've got a variety of enemies to get in your way. You've got trees that chase Bentley and get temporarily stunned when you jump over them. You have gem eaters who try to prevent you from getting that last gem bonus, but you can defeat them by running into them while they're scarfing down a gem. And there's also stuff like boiling oil pots, ghosts, evil spheres, and...
Oh, be me? Me be.
And most prominent of all, there's Bertilda the Witch, who appears every 4 levels and can only be beaten when you're wearing the magic hat. As it turns out, primary developer Frank Lanzinger and his co-workers got the idea for the fairy tale theming from The Wizard of Oz, and both Bentley and Bertilda came about as a result of these brainstorming sessions. As for the trackball controls, Lanzinger came up with that plan because he was a fan of a certain other game that Atari developed. As for Bentley, he's the closest that Atari ever got to a mascot, appearing in some Atari Edutainment computer games as well as Atari carts for the Jaguar. Not that most people really care about the Jaguar. What's more, a prominent member of the Atari homebrew community, Robert DiCrescenzo, made a homebrew game starring Bentley, and not only did Atari give this game an official release, but they made it a pack-in game for the 7800 Plus. So I guess this unique maze game really did spawn a mascot.
Good on you, Bentley. You're one of the few bear mascots I actually care about.
I've brought up in past videos how many of the earliest games were mainly targeted to men. Stuff like space shooters, racing games, etc. But in the early 80s, we started getting games that appealed to a broader demographic. 1981 seemed to be the year things opened up, with the initial release of games like Pac-Man, but Atari was contributing to the cause with, funny enough, another shooter. So, gardening appeals to people of all genders, right? And let's face it, creepy crawlies bug a lot of people. So what better medium than a game to take out your frustration? Centipede was a landmark title for Atari, being accessible enough for anyone to play, yet challenging enough to satisfy skilled players. You control a bug blaster with a trackball control, and your mission is to blast apart this centipede as it relentlessly crawls across the screen. There are mushrooms scattered across the screen to interfere with your shots, but you can just blast them away to get a clearer shot at the big bug. Of course, you have to shoot each segment of the centipede one by one, and if you hit the thing anywhere in the middle, it splits apart where you shot it, leaving you with more bugs to deal with. And not only that, you gotta deal with spiders that zigzag, fleas that drop toward you and spawn mushrooms, and scorpions that poison the mushrooms, and if the centipede hits a poison mushroom, it'll get mad and charge straight down towards you. Oh, and by the way, every time you blast a centipede segment, it'll turn into a mushroom. This whole setup lends itself to a very strategic approach to the game. Your target is the centipede, but you gotta manage the playfield so that you're not overrun with mushrooms, because every time the centipede hits one of them, it'll move down to the next row in its relentless march to exterminate you. So yeah, you can probably tell that this wasn't focused solely on guys. In fact, alongside Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man, it was one of the first games to have a significant female player base. According to estimates, about half the game's players were women. It only helps that a woman was one of the primary developers of the game. Donna Bailey developed Centipede alongside Ed Logg, and she was one of the few women programming in the industry at the time. In fact, the pastel aesthetic of the game was her idea, saying she wanted it to be visually interesting.
Yeah, women have always been a part of the video game industry. You just need to know where to look. Okay, warning you now, this next segment's gonna have some bright flashing colors, so if you have epilepsy, you might want to look away.
The year was 1980, in the midst of the Cold War. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were showing no signs of easing, and the specter of nuclear war continued to hang over the world like the sword of Damocles. It was during this time that programmer Dave Thoirer and junior programmer Rich Adam were tasked with creating a game inspired by the image of a radar screen. That game would become the first color game published by Atari, one of their most successful games, and a stark message on the realities of war. Its name was Missile Command. Hailed as one of the greats in the golden age of the arcades, this game stood out for its depiction of war in the nuclear age. You have command of 3 missile bases, and you're tasked with protecting 6 unnamed cities from an endless barrage of missiles fired by an unnamed aggressor. You have a trackball to control a crosshair, and 3 buttons to fire missiles from each button's respective base. Once a missile reaches its destination, it goes off, hopefully catching the enemy missiles in the blast radius and causing a chain reaction to destroy even more enemy missiles. You get bonus points for every missile every time you survive a wave, hopefully earning enough points for a bonus city. Things get dicier in later waves. You get missiles that split apart, you got smart bombs that can evade all but the most precise shots, and bomber planes that shoot missiles of their own. And hopefully your bases don't get hit either, because then they're out of commission. As like most early arcade games at the time, there's no way to win. You can only hope to survive as long as possible and maybe get one of those coveted high scores. The lack of names and the purely defensive gameplay were both conditions insisted on by Thoirer himself. He also was the one who made the call to put in a trackball because that would be faster than a joystick, which was necessary considering how hectic the game got. And if you think it was hard for the players, it was even harder for Thoirer and Adam, as the dreaded crunch was closing in on them in development. Thoirer even had nightmares about nuclear war as the deadline got closer. Not to mention that no programmer to date had gotten their first game published. But the final product was hailed as a classic, thanks to its colors, intense challenge, and unique gameplay, which can be seen as a precursor to the tower defense genre. So in the end, Thoirer ended up winning. Unlike what happens in the actual game.
The only winning move is not to play.
The thing about Thoirer's nightmares during Missile Command's development was that they didn't stop right away after the game launched. I mean, it's not too surprising, that ain't the kind of shit you just up and forget. But eventually they lessened and died down, only to be replaced with another nightmare about creatures crawling out of the ground. Yikes, the guy's mind couldn't catch a break. But this did give him the inspiration for another of Atari's most iconic titles, Tempest. Originally released in 1981 and initially conceived as a 3D remake of Space Invaders, the early versions of the game had their fair share of issues, but what Thoirer eventually came up with was even better. You use a track dial to maneuver a claw-shaped ship around the outer edge of a well as creatures relentlessly climb towards you. You gotta blast these creatures, either by shooting enemies in the same lane as you, or by using your once-per-level super zapper. You got flippers that try to drag you into the abyss, you got pulsars that try to electrocute your lane, you got fuse balls that jump along the edges, you got spikers that leave behind dangerous spikes that can get in the way of your warping to the next level, and you got tanks that slowly advance towards the top and can split into multiple other enemies. And you can tell how many enemies are left from all the dots at the center of the screen. Despite the simple premise of the game, it could get really intense really fast. Part of that comes down to the fact that there are different styles of playfields instead of the single screen affair that most games were at the time. There were 16 different layouts you could play on, with each level taking you to a different one. And you don't just snap to the next level either. You actually travel by dropping down the well, which can be tricky if there are spikes still there. While it may be intimidating for new players, the smooth difficulty progression was lauded by many critics and encouraged players to keep playing. This was also bolstered by the game's snazzy vector graphics, made possible by Atari's color quadrascan vector display. It was also the first game to allow players to choose their starting level, a feature we'd see in several future games from multiple companies. Atari referred to this as the skill step system, and it also functioned as a de facto continue feature. Several publications have hailed Tempest as an all-time great, and it would go on to inspire several game designers such as John O'Neill and Jeff Minter, the latter of whom would go on to make a few sequels to the game, including Tempest 2000 for the ill-fated Jaguar, and Tempest 3000 for the even worse-fated Nuon, before later founding Llamasoft, who would go on to develop Tempest 4000 for modern platforms.
I guess some games really, really stick with you.
And before we move on, here are a few honorable mentions. Warlords. Think tower defense Pong for 4 players. Black Widow. Hope you're not an arachnophobe for this twin-stick shooter. Cloak and Dagger. FYI, I am a spy. iRobot. No, this isn't based on Asimov's novels. And Quantum. The high score even gets to sign their name with the trackball. And now let's see what the Arcade Nation has to say with this month's patron picks.
Lunar Lander isn't exactly the most complex Atari game, but being someone who's a bit of a perfectionist, landing the probe on the planet just right feels immensely satisfying to me. It just tickles my neurons in a way most Atari arcade games don't.
Battlezone turned out to be quite revolutionary after its 1980 release. Innovative 3D vector graphics first used in Lunar Lander and Asteroids, and a periscope viewfinder to simulate actual tank scopes helped it become an immersive experience. So much so that a version of it, the Bradley Trainer, was designed for army use in training real-life gunners. In a way, Battlezone could be considered the first VR arcade game, and it was definitely a favorite of mine from the decade I was born in.
There's this idea that's referred to as a generational game. A game that defines an era. Games like Final Fantasy VII, Breath of the Wild, Undertale, and looking back to the early days, games like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, and Space Invaders. So, for the first majorly successful game company, you would think that they would be responsible for at least one such title. That supreme echelon is where we'll find Atari's magnum opus, Asteroids. Released in 1979, Asteroids is Atari's most successful arcade game of all time, surpassing even Taito's Space Invaders in North America. Developed by Ed Logg and Lyle Rains using hardware developed by Wendy Allen, this vector-based masterpiece is such a simple idea. You have a ship, and you've got a field of asteroids all around you. Your mission? Blast every single one of them to dust. Of course, each time you shoot a big asteroid, it splits into smaller asteroids, which then split into even smaller asteroids, and then they're blasted to dust. Complicating matters is the occasional UFO which can actually shoot back at you, but it's worth bonus points when you blast it. Of course, you're not locked in place. Aside from 2 buttons for rotating left and right, you also have a thruster for propelling yourself in the direction you're facing. Just be careful of your momentum once you turn your thruster off. And if things get really dicey, there's one last Hail Mary, the hyperspace button, which will warp you to a random spot on the screen. Of course, Hail Marys are risky for a reason. You could end up right in the path of one of those asteroids you've been blasting. Oh, and to make sure you've got enough space to work with, objects wrap around when they reach a screen edge. The idea for this incredibly addictive game came when Rains and Log were discussing an ultimately cancelled game called Cosmos, which included a giant indestructible asteroid, and Log simply suggested that they make a game with rocks you can actually destroy. This actually combined the stage-clearing model of Space Invaders with the 2D movement of Space War, which was one of the first computer games, thus creating something truly unique for the era. And it was huge, though this was mainly in America. It got so big that manufacturers had to increase the size of the coin boxes, and they even ended up putting asteroids in several hundred cabinets that had been built for another Atari game, Lunar Lander. Even its home ports were game changers. The Atari 2600 home port marked the first game for the system to implement bank switching, which upped the ROM size from 4 kilobytes to 8 kilobytes. Said port sold 3 million copies, by the way. Asteroids would also go on to directly inspire other iconic games such as Defender, Gravatar, and many others. With this level of popularity, success, and influence over future games, it's not too hard to see why Asteroids is one of the games that defined Atari, and is well deserving of its place at number 1. This was, without question, a generational game.
And as for the games that fell under the Atari Games label, well, those are technically owned by Warner Brothers right now. But who knows? Maybe today's Atari can scoop up the rights to those IPs as well. They grabbed a few games from Ubisoft, so I guess anything's possible. They'd certainly be in better hands if they did. I'm the Quarter Guy, and until next time, the arcade is closed.
Hey everyone, QG here. If you liked the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video around. Feel free to check me out on Blue Sky and Tumblr, as well as my live streams on Twitch. If you want to support my channel, you can become a channel member or check out my Patreon, and don't forget about my Extra Life campaign supporting Children's Wisconsin. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.